Who was the gray-cloaked old man whose silent presence stopped a tyrant without drawing a single blade? Was he a man of flesh and blood, or the returning spirit of liberty itself? Why did armed soldiers tremble before his calm, unwavering gaze? And can the soul of freedom ever truly vanish, or does it rise whenever justice is threatened? Welcome to Classic Storytime Hub, presenting The Gray Champion by Nathaniel Hawthorne, a classic tale reimagined and retold in English.
There was a darker chapter in New England's past, one heavier, more suffocating than the injustices that would later ignite the American Revolution. This was a time when oppression was not a distant threat, but a weight pressing down on daily life. The English crown, under James II, a king driven by rigid belief and blind authority, tore away the colony's charters as if they were scraps of paper. In their place, he installed a man chosen not to serve the people, but to break them. That man was Sir Edmund Andros, a governor in name, a tyrant in practice. His rule carried every mark of absolute power. Laws were imposed without consent, taxes were demanded without representation, property rights were dismissed, land titles declared meaningless. Voices of protest were silenced before they could rise, crushed by restrictions on speech and the press. And when fear alone was not enough, armed soldiers marched through colonial streets, the first mercenary force ever to tread that soil, making clear that resistance would be answered with steel. For 2 long years the people endured, not because they agreed, but because loyalty still lingered, an inherited devotion to the distant mother country, no matter who ruled it, Parliament, protector, or king. Yet this loyalty was fragile, almost ceremonial. Until this moment, the colonies had largely governed themselves, enjoying freedoms that ordinary citizens in England could scarcely imagine. Now, those freedoms were slipping away. Then, at last, a whisper crossed the ocean. A rumor, dangerous, uncertain, and electrifying, spread quietly from ear to ear. It spoke of the Prince of Orange daring to challenge King James himself. If true, it could mean deliverance, the restoration of civil rights, the protection of faith, the survival of New England's soul. But it was only a rumor. If it proved false or failed, anyone bold enough to act on it would be signing their own death warrant. And so the people waited, caught between fear and hope, silence and rebellion, history holding its breath. Even so, the news, uncertain as it was, changed everything. Something subtle shifted in the air. People began to exchange knowing smiles in the streets, brief and restrained, yet heavy with meaning. Their eyes no longer dropped when soldiers passed. Instead, they held steady, challenging, unafraid. Across towns and villages, an unspoken tension spread, quiet but alive, as though the entire land stood half awake, ready to rise at the smallest signal. Those in power sensed the danger immediately. The rulers chose intimidation as their answer. They would remind the people who held control, and perhaps tighten their grip even further. One afternoon in April of 1689, Sir Edmund Andros, flushed with wine and confidence, gathered his most loyal councillors. Together they summoned the governor's guard. Red-coated soldiers fell into formation, and as the sun drifted toward the horizon, the column moved into the streets of Boston. The drums began to beat. But at that uneasy hour, the sound carried a meaning far beyond military order. It echoed through the narrow streets, not merely as marching music, but as a summons, calling the people themselves. From every direction, men emerged and converged on King Street, a place already marked by destiny, though none could yet know it would witness another clash between British authority and a people who refused to bow. More than 60 years had passed since the first settlers stepped onto this land, yet in this gathering of their descendants the old spirit was unmistakable. Their clothing was plain, their faces were stern, shaped by discipline and belief. There was darkness in their expressions, but no fear. They spoke in measured words, often drawn from Scripture, and beneath their restraint burned a quiet certainty that heaven itself stood with those who resisted injustice. This was not a mob driven by chaos. It was a people standing at the edge of history, silent, resolute, and ready.
The old spirit was far from dead. That day, standing in the street, were men who remembered worshiping beneath open skies, when faith had no walls, only trees overhead, and exile was the price of devotion. They had prayed there long before any church had risen from the ground. Beside them stood veterans of earlier wars, former soldiers of Parliament, wearing grim smiles, quietly wondering whether their aging arms might yet be called upon to strike once more against the House of Stuart. There were others, too, men hardened by King Philip's War, veterans who had marched through fire and blood, who had burned villages and cut down enemies young and old with fierce conviction, believing every act justified by prayer whispered behind them across the land. Their faces now were weathered, unreadable, but their presence alone carried a warning. Scattered among the crowd stood ministers of the church. This was no ordinary gathering, and they were no ordinary spectators. Unlike other mobs, the people parted respectfully around these men, as though holiness itself clung to their clothing. The ministers spoke quietly, urging restraint, not dispersal. Calm, not surrender. Their voices cooled the crowd, but did not send it home. All the while, a single question passed from mouth to mouth. Why now? Why would the governor provoke the town at such a fragile moment, when even the smallest spark could ignite the entire country? Answers multiplied as fear took shape. Satan is making his final move, some whispered. He knows his time is short. They will seize our pastors, drag them to prison, burn them in King Street, just like the martyrs of old. At this, the people instinctively closed ranks around their ministers, each parish tightening its circle. The clergymen lifted their eyes heavenward, faces calm, expressions steady, assuming a quiet, almost solemn dignity. It was the posture of men prepared not merely to lead, but to suffer. Some even believed that New England itself stood on the brink of producing its own martyr, a new name to replace the heroes of sacred memory, a man whose fate might be taught to children, recited in primers, and remembered long after the smoke had cleared. History once again seemed ready to demand a sacrifice. "The Pope has given the order," some cried in terror. "Another St. Bartholomew is coming. We'll be slaughtered, men and even our sons." The fear spread quickly, and though many dismissed the rumor as madness, even the cautious sensed that something dark was unfolding. Few believed the governor's intentions were quite so monstrous, but few trusted him either. Word had already spread that Governor Bradstreet, the last leader under the old charter and a living relic of the first settlers, was in Boston. A theory took hold. Andros meant to strike hard and fast, displaying military power to terrify the people, while quietly seizing their most respected figurehead. The crowd latched on to the thought. "Stand firm for the old charter," voices rose. "For Governor Bradstreet, the good old governor." The chant surged until it faltered. High above them, on the steps of a nearby doorway, stood the very man they were invoking.
Bradstreet himself, nearly 90 years old, a patriarch bent by time but unbroken in spirit. He raised his hand, and the noise softened. His voice, gentle and steady, carried across the street. "My children," he said calmly, "do nothing in haste. Raise no violent cries. Pray instead for the welfare of New England, and wait patiently for what the Lord intends." His words settled like a hush over the crowd. But history was already moving. From the direction of Cornhill, the drums had been drawing closer, each beat heavier than the last. The sound rolled between the houses, deep and relentless, until it seemed the street itself was trembling. Then, with a sudden surge of noise and motion, the soldiers emerged. They advanced in tight formation, 2 ranks wide, filling the entire street. Matchlocks rested on their shoulders, slow-burning matches glowing in the dusk. In the fading light, the flames formed a line of fire, marching forward step by measured step. The moment had arrived, and whatever would follow, there was no turning back.
Their advance felt mechanical, cold, deliberate, unstoppable. The soldiers moved as a single body, like an iron engine designed to crush whatever stood before it. There was no hesitation in their steps, no sign of doubt, only forward motion. Behind them came the mounted procession. Hooves struck the stone pavement in uneven rhythm, the sound sharp and unsettling. At the center rode Sir Edmund Andros himself, aged yet rigid in posture, carrying himself with the practiced bearing of a lifelong soldier. His presence alone radiated authority, hardened by years of command and indifference to those beneath it. Flanking him were the men most despised in New England. At his right rode Edward Randolph, the colony's sworn adversary, the architect of its political ruin. His name alone provoked bitterness. He was remembered as a man who had dismantled the old government piece by piece, earning curses that followed him long after his work was done, whispered even at the mention of his grave. On the opposite side rode Bullivant, laughing as he went, tossing insults and jokes into the air as though the crowd were no more than a source of amusement. Behind them came Dudley, his eyes cast downward, unable or unwilling to meet the burning stares of the people. Born among them, he now rode as their betrayer, aligned with the forces strangling his own homeland. Others followed close behind, a naval officer from a warship anchored in the harbor, along with several civil officials acting in the name of the crown. Yet none of these figures stirred the crowd as deeply as the man who rode among the magistrates in sacred garments. The Episcopal clergyman of King's Chapel moved forward proudly, wrapped in priestly vestments, elevated above the people both in posture and attitude. To the crowd, he embodied everything they had fled across the ocean to escape, the fusion of church and state, religious authority bound to political power, faith wielded as a weapon. In his presence lived the memory of persecution and the reason the wilderness had once seemed safer than civilization. And still the procession was not finished. Another line of soldiers followed behind, 2 ranks deep, sealing the formation, enclosing the street in armed order. The message was unmistakable. Power had arrived, not to listen, but to command. The scene before them was a mirror of New England, 2 worlds facing one another. On one side, the faithful, draped in somber garb, faces lined with worry, eyes shadowed by years of trial. On the other, the rulers, opulent, arrogant, flushed with wine, cloaked in the authority of church and crown, their crucifixes glinting in the dim light mocked the murmured groans of the people. And behind the pomp, the mercenary soldiers waited, motionless yet menacing, ready to drown the street in blood at a single command. Obedience, it seemed, came only at the point of a musket. From the crowd, a voice rang out, raw with desperation. "O Lord of hosts, provide a champion for thy people." The cry echoed through the narrow street like a summons from heaven. The multitude instinctively drew back, clustering near the far end of the street, leaving a wide paved space between themselves and the advancing soldiers. A shadowed corridor between towering buildings, drenched in the dim, dusky light of early evening. Then, from that empty space, he appeared. Alone, walking steadily toward the line of armed men, came an ancient figure, a man seeming plucked from another era. He wore the austere garb of the old Puritans, a dark cloak draped over his shoulders, a steeple-crowned hat perched atop his hip, a heavy sword at his hip. In his hand, a simple staff steadied his steps, betraying the weight of years, yet not diminishing the dignity in his stance. He advanced slowly, each step deliberate, until he reached the center of the street. Then, turning, he faced the crowd behind him. His eyes, sharp despite age, swept over them with both caution and reassurance. His beard, long and silver, flowed down to his chest, giving his face an aura of venerable authority. He raised his hand, a gesture at once commanding and protective, then turned back toward the soldiers and continued forward, unyielding, a solitary figure confronting the power of tyranny itself. In that moment, the air seemed to still. The people held their breath. History had summoned its champion.
"Who is this gray patriarch?" whispered the young men to their fathers. "Who is this venerable brother?" murmured the elders among themselves. Yet no one could answer. Even the oldest men, those well past 80, felt a strange unease, as though a memory had been stolen from them. How could they have forgotten this figure of such unmistakable authority? A man who must have walked among them in their youth, a companion of Winthrop and the early counselors, giving laws, leading prayers, and guiding their forebears against the wilderness and its perils. Surely, in his own youth, his hair had been gray, as theirs now were, and yet they could not recall him. And the young men, how could they have ever known him? This hoary elder of relic from a time long past, whose solemn blessing had surely been laid upon their heads when they were children. How could such a figure vanish so completely from memory? Where did he come from? What is his purpose? Who is this old man? The crowd whispered, their voices trembling with awe and curiosity. Meanwhile, the stranger continued his solitary path along the center of the street. Staff in hand, he approached the soldiers, and with every beat of the drum, he seemed to draw strength from the sound. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the weight of age lifted from his shoulders. The frailty of years fell away, leaving only a figure of unbroken gray dignity. Step by measured step he advanced, matching the rhythm of the military march. On one side, the old man, on the other, the full parade of soldiers and magistrates, proud and armed. When barely 20 yards separated them, the old man planted his staff firmly before him, gripping it in the middle like a commander wielding a truncheon. "Stand!" he commanded, and the single word carried the weight of a nation's judgment. Every eye was fixed, every breath held. The old man's gaze, his commanding posture, the deep, solemn resonance of his voice, capable of rallying an army on the battlefield or lifting the spirit of a nation in prayer, was utterly irresistible. At the sound of his word, at the sweep of his outstretched arm, the drums fell silent. The soldiers froze in place, halted mid-step, as if the very air obeyed him. A wave of trembling awe ran through the crowd. This figure, half leader, half saint,
so gray, so dimly visible in the fading light, garbed in the clothing of a bygone age, could only be a champion of the righteous, summoned from the grave itself to confront tyranny. The people erupted in shouts of reverence and exultation, their hope for the deliverance of New England surging in every voice. The governor and his counselors, caught off guard by this sudden defiance, pressed forward on their horses, nostrils flaring as if to charge the venerable figure. Yet the old man did not flinch. His eyes swept over the assembled magistrates and soldiers, unyielding, until they rested, sharp and unwavering, on Sir Edmund Andros himself. For a moment it seemed the entire balance of power had shifted. Here stood a single man, frail yet commanding, and behind him the crown, with all its soldiers and authority, appeared almost helpless. "What is this old man doing here?" shouted Edward Randolph, voice sharp with fury. "Nay, nay," said Bullivant, laughing, trying to mask unease. "He is some round-headed relic, asleep these 30 years, and knows nothing of these times. Likely he thinks he can stop us with some stale proclamation from old Noll." But the crowd knew better. The air vibrated with the unshakable certainty that this gray patriarch was no mere relic. He was the living embodiment of New England's spirit, and for the first time, tyranny was being measured against a power it had not expected.
"Are you mad, old man?" Sir Edmund Andros thundered, his voice sharp and harsh. "How dare you halt the march of King James's governor?" The gray figure stood unmoved, calm yet unyielding. His voice, grave and resonant, carried across the street. "I have stayed the march of a king himself more than once," he replied, his words deliberate, weighted with centuries of authority. "I am here, Governor, because the cry of an oppressed people reached me in my secret place. I prayed for guidance, and it was granted that I might walk the earth again in the defense of the righteous. And what speak you of James? That tyrant's reign is ended. By tomorrow noon, his name will be a curse even in this street where you hoped it would strike terror. Step back, Governor. Tonight your authority dies. Tomorrow the prison awaits. Step back, or I foretell the scaffold." The crowd, drawn ever closer, hung on every word. His voice was archaic, shaped by the speech of long-forgotten years, as if he had only spoken to the dead of the past, yet it struck their souls like fire. The people pressed forward, not entirely unarmed. Stones, bricks, anything at hand could become a weapon in their hands. They were ready, inspired, unafraid. Sir Edmund Andros scanned the gray man and then the crowd. He saw the fury simmering in their eyes, fury that was not easily stirred and impossible to quench once it had flared. Then he returned his gaze to the solitary figure, standing alone in the open space between them, neither shielded nor reinforced by friend or foe. What he thought, no one could tell. His lips were sealed, his cruel mind remained a shadow, hidden even from himself. The street seemed to hold its breath. History itself waited on the gray shoulders of one man, defying the power of kings. Whether it was the sheer force of the gray champion's gaze or the silent warning of the people ready to erupt, no one can say, but Sir Edmund Andros faltered. Slowly, carefully, he signaled his soldiers to fall back, their red coats retreating like a tide, ebbing under an unseen power. By the next sunset, the governor and all those who had ridden so proudly at his side were captured. Long before the colonies had heard of James's abdication, King William was proclaimed across New England, and freedom stirred again in the hearts of the people. And yet, where had the gray champion gone? Some whispered that as the soldiers vanished and the crowd surged forward, Bradstreet, the aged governor, had been seen embracing a figure even older, more gray than himself. Others claimed that the venerable man simply faded into the twilight, melting into the shadows until nothing remained but empty space. Whatever the truth, all agreed the hoary champion had vanished. Generations watched for his return, in sunlight, in twilight, but he never appeared again. No one knew when his funeral passed, or where his grave might lie. Who, then, was the Gray Champion? Perhaps his name is written in the records of that stern court of justice, which passed a judgment too mighty for its age, yet immortal in its lesson, humbling a monarch, inspiring the subject, and proving that courage and justice endure. It is said that whenever the descendants of the Puritans must show the spirit of their ancestors, the old man appears again, silent, gray, and unyielding, the eternal guardian of liberty and the righteous cause.
Decades passed, 80 years, and yet he walked once more along King Street, silent and resolute, a shadow of the past stepping into the present. 5 years later, in the soft twilight of an April morning, he appeared on the green beside the meeting house at Lexington, where today a granite obelisk inlaid with slate marks the resting place of the first patriots to fall in the Revolution. And when our fathers labored through that fateful night at Bunker Hill, the old warrior, gray, steadfast, eternal, kept his rounds through the darkness, unseen yet unforgotten. Long may it be before he comes again. His hour belongs to darkness, to adversity, to peril. But should tyranny rise at home, or the foot of an invader tread upon our soil, the Gray Champion will return. For he is more than a man. He is the embodiment of New England's enduring spirit, the living pledge that, when danger comes, the sons of the soil will rise to defend their inheritance. His shadowed march, silent yet commanding, will always signal hope, courage, and the unyielding resolve of a free people.
And thus the story ended. If you liked this journey into the worlds of classic literature, do not forget to support us by subscribing so we can tell you more. And hey, if there's a classic tale you'd love to hear told in this suspenseful style, drop its name in the comments below. Your suggestion might be our next chilling adventure.